Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we've figured out everything technically this morning. It's great to have you here at the Forum, where each week we look at important issues at the intersection of faith and the modern world. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here at St. Bart's. And today I'm very pleased to be joined by Knox Sutterfield, who is a longtime friend. He's a choral conductor who is the music director of the Florilegium Chamber Choir on the Upper West Side, as well as the Kent Singers in Kent, Connecticut. I believe he's also the associate artistic director of Inspire, a choir for unity. So he's got a lot of choirs that he's involved with, and so I think he's the perfect person to talk about this morning's subject, which is the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, which will be read and sung this morning at all of our services, and which has a long history within the liturgical church. So Knox, it is great to have you here to introduce the song and the way in which musicians have treated it over the centuries.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all. It's good to see you, those of you who are here live, and welcome to those who are at home. I'm delighted to talk very briefly because as I was preparing for this, I thought, gee, I'd really love to teach like a graduate seminar for a whole semester on this topic. But we'll just touch a little bit on the Magnificat today and some of the many, many wonderful settings that composers have done of this magnificent text over the centuries. So to start, we should talk about canticles, right? Because the Magnificat is a canticle. And just because I know we all have different backgrounds and familiarities with these things, I wanted to give a brief overview. So canticles are these psalm-like texts that we find predominantly, they're scriptural, though we also include some that are not scriptural. And in the Book of Common Prayer, they're numbered 1 through 21, but really 7 of them are the Right One translations, and then there are 14 distinct ones. And there's a whole table in the Book of Common Prayer that tells you when you can use different ones and recommendations for that. The biblical sources for the canticles include the Book of Exodus, like the Song of Moses. There are 3 songs from Isaiah. There are several from Luke, including the Magnificat, and a couple from Revelation as well. There's some that have deuterocanonical sources or apocryphal sources. So there's the Song of the Three Young Men, which are the 3 young men from Daniel. That is a lengthy text and full of praise, right? They're singing and they're excited and grateful. And then also the prayer of Manasseh is the source of one of our canticles. The ones that are non-biblical, we have the Gloria in Excelsis, which is of course based on the Song of the Angels in the Gospel, but is longer than it appears in the Gospel, and the Te Deum Laudamus, which is an ancient hymn that is also not out of the Bible. So there are lots and lots of different canticles, and we maybe don't get to spend lots of time with them unless you regularly attend morning prayer or evening prayer, because the canticles don't make their way into Eucharist as often. And so I'll talk just a little bit about the daily offices. I mentioned morning prayer and evening prayer. So you may remember from history class at some point talking about Saint Benedict, who created the rule of Saint Benedict. And that's where we sort of codified back in 516 the 8 daily offices. And so the monks would get up at 8 different times. They would stop whatever they were doing, including sleeping, and go pray, right? And so they had matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nones, vespers, and compline. And we don't have that many offices in the Anglican Communion. Our primary ones are morning prayer, which equates to matins, and evening prayer, which equates to vespers, which is sort of the, bedtime. And then we also often celebrate compline as sort of a third office. There is a noon prayer, but the 2 main ones are morning prayer and evening prayer. Evening prayer is also called evensong, and it has a particularly strong tradition in the UK. So lots of the cathedral choirs and a lot of the college choirs, particularly Cambridge and Oxford, they'll sing evensong 4 or more times a week. Not just on Sundays, they'll do it throughout the week. And these choirs are turning out lots and lots of music, performing many different settings of the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, which are the primary canticles in evensong, as well as psalms. And so the idea behind these offices originally really was prayers and to get through the entire Psalter. So they would chant all 150 psalms in the space of just 1 week. And the canticles are these sort of extra bits that are very similar to the psalms but get mixed in among those psalms at specific offices. And so the canticles that are most familiar to those who kind of live in the choral tradition are typically the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis, because they're both from evensong. So the Magnificat, the Song of Mary; the Nunc Dimittis is the Song of Simeon. Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace. The Te Deum also gets sung quite a bit. There are many wonderful settings of the Te Deum. And there are lots of settings of all of them because they have at some point been a part of services where choirs were heavily involved. But in the Anglican communion and in our choral tradition, it's primarily the Mag and the Nunc that we hear over and over and over again, and has so captivated composers as well as performers for so many centuries. There is a biblical basis for the daily offices, I should mention at least, particularly in Psalm, I think 118 or 119, Psalm 119, which is a long. There are a couple of verses. One talks about praising God 7 times a day, and one verse talks about getting up at midnight and praying, and that's how Benedict ended up with 8 offices, because there were the 7 times a day, but they needed to add one for midnight. They also have their root in Jewish prayer practices. There was, in Exodus, is laid out the idea of a sacrifice both in the morning and in the evening, and so Jewish prayer services originated with this same kind of structured, specific hours for prayer that then got picked up by early Christians, and it was a part of practices. We read about it in the book of Acts. We can, throughout the Bible itself, and then also looking at history and how Christian practices evolved over the centuries, it got more and more rigidly set for these daily offices. So I mentioned at evensong, the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis are the 2 canticles that are sung. Psalms are also typically sung or spoken. And of course, you can do, if it's not sung, it's just evening prayer, right? So you can have evening prayer or evensong, and it can either be sung or spoken or a combination of the 2. So the text, Magnificat anima mea, my soul magnifies, right? The Lord would be the next bit. We use this text, we use the word incipit, is the beginning of a text. We use incipits to refer to lots of psalms as well. The Jubilate Deo, the Benedictus, right? They're the Venite, it's the first line of the translation in the Vulgate, and so it was the familiar way that it was chanted for many centuries in Latin. So we often use the first bit of the Latin Vulgate translation, this incipit. So that's why we call it the Magnificat. It's also called the Song of Mary. And similarly, the Nunc Dimittis, that is the Latin incipit for the Song of Simeon. So let's look at the text. This is the translation. This is the Rite One translation in the Book of Common Prayer. And I chose that specifically because that's the one that has the most settings in the Anglican tradition. So Mary, in Luke 1, after the Annunciation, right, discovering that she is going to bear the Messiah, she goes and visits her cousin Elizabeth, and Elizabeth, right, recognizes, and John the Baptist, later John the Baptist, the baby in her womb leaps in recognition, and so Elizabeth kind of echoes what the angel had said. She says some words that are very similar to the Ave Maria, and then Mary's response is this text. And she says, "My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior. For he hath regarded the lowliness of his handmaiden. For behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed. For he that is mighty hath magnified me, and holy is his name, and his mercy is on them that fear him throughout all generations. He hath shown strength with his arm, he hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent empty away. He, remembering his mercy, hath holpen his servant Israel, as he promised to our forefathers Abraham and his seed forever." And this text, it kind of feels like a psalm, right? We recognize similar patterns to the structure of it. It echoes texts we encounter throughout the Old Testament and it specifically echoes the Song of Hannah in 1 Samuel. And I'll read just the very beginning of that. Hannah sings, "My heart exults in the Lord, my strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no holy one like the Lord." Right, so there's a similar structure. She gets into the same talking about his mighty acts, talking about that sort of thing. It's part of this sort of tradition of these texts. And I want to call your attention particularly to the structure, because composers have loved the structure of this text. There's sort of 4 sections. If we go back, at the beginning she's rejoicing, right? "My soul doth magnify the Lord, he hath regarded the lowliness of his handmaiden." And then she glorifies God for what God is doing. "For he that is mighty hath magnified me, holy is his name. His mercy is on them that fear him throughout all generations." And then we get this amazing set of parallelism that's all about the transformation that God is accomplishing through the Messiah. She talks about God showing strength, scattering the proud, putting down the mighty while exalting the humble and meek, filling the hungry with good things while sending the rich away. This turning over, this transformation that's going to happen. And then at the end, she talks about God remembering the promise made to Abraham. And so these are sort of the 4 big sections, and each verse in there has imagery, has action, has its own sort of identity. And this is what has really called to composers over the centuries to set this. I think I cut out. I want to look first at the one of the 8 different settings within the Liber Usualis, which is the sort of compendium of Gregorian chant that was standardized, and from which some people still are chanting the Psalter and also parts of the Mass and the rest of the daily offices. And so this is the notation that you would find in that book, and it's Magnificat anima mea Dominum, et exultavit spiritus meus, in Deo salutari meo. And you would have one person usually introduces the first little bit, and then the others would join in. Often you'd have, if we're thinking about a monastery, the monks would be in the what we consider the choir, right? And they'd be facing each other, sitting on 2 different sides, and so they alternate verses. They do the same thing for psalms. You can experience that today if you go up to Holy Cross Monastery up in the Hudson Valley. You can go pray the offices with the brothers, and so this is a ongoing, many centuries old tradition. And so some of the earliest composed settings that are not just plain chant use the tones and will alternate a chanted verse with then a verse that was set for choir. And I mentioned that there are 8 different tones. So some composers thought, well, I'm going to do one for each of the eight tones. And so I'm going to exit this for a moment and play for you just a little bit of one by Cristobal de Morales, a really gorgeous setting. And you'll hear the alternate verses. I'll a couple of them, but you'll hear the alternate verses that are chanted and then sung in polyphony, in this high Renaissance style of polyphony. We have verse 3. And back to polyphony for the 4th verse. So Palestrina, for example, right, one of the biggest names of the Renaissance, wrote 35 different settings of the Magnificat, including incorporating all 8 of the different tones to which it was chanted. And there are thousands and thousands of settings, so I'm just going to give you a little sampling of a few of them today. The next one I want to talk a little bit about is a bit of a bigger setting by Claudio Monteverdi from his Vespers that he wrote in 1610 for St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. This is one of the sort of monumental pieces of music history, something that gets covered in every music history class. This incredible sort of mature, early Baroque style and Venetian, using the space, the magnificent space of St. Mark's with choirs and set in different places and instruments all around. And here we get one of the early examples of this sort of larger scale composition of the Magnificat, and someone who's taking not, alternating between a plain chant verse and a polyphonic verse, or composing straight through a polyphonic setting, but actually taking each different verse and setting that text in its own kind of distinct movement. With Monteverdi, they're not too long, because the Magnificat was just one part of the Vespers service, right? So he gives us about 18 minutes. Obviously, we won't listen to all of it. But he gives us about 18 minutes worth of music for the Magnificat, but that's just part of this whole service that's mostly made up of psalm settings. But you'll hear really, really different instrumentation, different voicing for each verse, and he's tapping into trying to paint the text differently and capture the emotions and the sense of the text at each turn. So it begins. And this is something that we get from many composers, is either beginning the piece with a solo soprano or alto, a treble voice, or beginning with this big exclamation from the choir, and maybe the orchestra is involved too, but then immediately going into a high solo voice, right? Because it is the Song of Mary, and trying to, even in a setting where the sopranos are all boys, giving that high treble sound to go back to the idea that here is this young girl who's singing this text. And so there are so many settings that do that, and it happens all across the centuries. And so Monteverdi does that there as well. But I'll give you a little bit of the next movement as well. Et exultavit, right? He has exalted me. And so you can hear just how different that is from that's the very next movement, how different it is from the sort of stately opening with the chorus, and then the very personal, intimate solo soprano singing. And then I'll just click through a little bit. Right, totally different yet again. Different yet again. This is now, he hath filled the hungry with good things, much later in the text. But you can hear just the variety of color and instrumentation and tempo and voicing that Monteverdi is using, inspired by this text. We turn a little bit later in the Baroque period to Johann Sebastian Bach, whose Magnificat is probably the sort of biggest concert performance. If you're going to do one Magnificat, this is probably the one you do. And you'll hear lots of orchestra, this sort of very different sound from the Venetian 1610 orchestra by the time we get to the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. An orchestra that's more familiar, right? Sounds a lot more like the orchestras we have now. And I find it interesting that even though he starts with full choir, he starts with the sopranos, right? He's reminding us that this is the Song of Mary, and then the next two movements are soprano solos. So I'll give you just the very beginning of it, and then we'll catch a couple of snippets of some of the other movements. That's not it. And while this great orchestra plays, I'm going to talk over them. At this point, we're hearing the Magnificat more like an oratorio, right? It's like going to hear Messiah or any of the other oratorios that we're familiar with, where each movement is going to be a fully developed either chorus or aria. We've got a whole orchestral introduction here, and it's really expansive and giving us time to dive into that text. And it's just this explosion of praise, right? We really hear that in this music. And then Bach turns it to, again, this more intimate and individual soprano singing for the next movement. And she sings Et exultavit, right? He hath exalted me. And then in the next movement, I'll give you a taste of this too. She sings about, for he hath regarded the lowliness of his handmaiden. And you can hear Bach trying to kind of convey the sense of humility, both with the instrumentation. We tend to think of oboes and English horns. We associate them with shepherds, right? A lowly profession. There's sort of that pastoral thing. It's plaintive. It feels maybe a little less confident, maybe a little less exuberant, but it's still grateful. So we've come a long way from the first movement with this, fiery strings and all of the orchestra and the choir singing rapidly and exuberantly. And so Bach, like many of the composers after him, has really tried to take us to the emotional extremes of the text and give us this extraordinary text painting. I'll give you just a little bit more. Once we get to all generations shall call me blessed, he gives us the full chorus because it's all generations, right? And then I also wanted to give you a little bit of the deposuit. So he hath cast down he hath put down the lady from, and you'll hear the putting down in the text, in the music. Right, so it's he's really telegraphing to the audience so that even if you're not exactly following along with the text, you get a sense of what's happening, right? And so now I want to turn our attention to specifically the Anglican tradition. There are many, many settings. nearly as many as I would love to. But Anglican choral tradition, we also have centuries worth of settings that were composed specifically for a choir to sing within an evening service at evensong. Typically, these settings are a pair. The composer will set both the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis. Often, they're linked by the Gloria Patri at the end. So glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, right? That text, which is not in the biblical text, gets appended to the end of these canticles in the same way that it gets appended to the end of Psalms, depending on which service you're in. And so often composers will put the same Gloria Patri at the end of the two movements as kind of these two things are connected. We're not going to get into settings of the Nunc Dimittis today, but one thing to note is that in the Magnificat, right, we have this young woman, and then in the Nunc Dimittis, right, it's Simeon, this old man who's been waiting his entire life for the Messiah. And so we have this contrast of these two voices. And often composers will really try to lean into that, starting the Magnificat with a soprano or high voices, and maybe the Nunc Dimittis is a tenor or baritone solo, or it at least starts lower. You know, they really try to play into the difference between the two texts and highlighting that they are responding to the same event, the coming of the Messiah, but from two very different perspectives and in two very different ways. You may recognize some of the names of these composers, right? Orlando Gibbons, English Renaissance composer, Byrd, Tallis, they also composed settings of this in English. Henry Purcell, one of the greats of the English Baroque period, wrote at least 2 evening services. Charles Villiers Stanford set the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis in just about every key. He wrote very many of them. And these are just some. Charles Wood and Herbert Sumison probably less familiar outside of sort of Anglican choral circles. Herbert Howells also less familiar outside of Anglican choral circles, but he wrote 18 settings of the Mag and Nunc, and several of those are my favorites. He really had such a strong tradition to build upon by the time he was composing. So let's give a little bit of a listen to just a couple of things. I'm going to play for you the beginning of the Stanford in G, which is one of. That's not it. This is it. And so the soprano soloist, here sung by a boy, begins it. And then we get the choir responds. People have also noted that the organ accompaniment is this sort of spinning thing, and that there are many paintings of the Visitation with Mary and Elizabeth, where there's a spinning wheel in the painting, and that perhaps this was Stanford playing off of that. Similarly, Herbert Howells, in multiple settings, including this one, which is the one he composed for King's College, begin with high voices. And if I skip ahead a little bit, we get to the text, "He hath shown strength with his arm." A little bit longer. There it is. And now we get the full choir. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. Right, so in a more sort of economical space, in the span of only 5 minutes instead of 18 or 30 minutes, we have composers still responding to all of the different turns in this text and trying to find a really, really expressive, captivating way to set it. I know that I'm about out of time, but I just want to touch on the fact that, of course, as with most of Western music, right, the systems were set up such that almost all of the music is written by men, performed by boys and men for many centuries, right? But here we have this text by a young woman. And so while, composers, I think, as I talked about, have tried to acknowledge that it is a text by a young woman, it is nevertheless the perspective of men composing. And I wanted to just play the very beginning of a contemporary setting by a female composer, Tawny Olson. And this one, she uses, quite cleverly, a girls' choir singing the text from the Magnificat in the style of Bulgarian female choral singing, which is this kind of powerful, strong way of singing that you'll hear. And then the choir of adults sings the text of the Ave Maria. We won't get that far into it, but this juxtaposition, trying to highlight young women and putting them at the center of this text. And so then the tenors come in singing the part of the angel Ave Maria. So just a tiny sampling of the many settings out there, but I hope that you get a sense of how inspirational this text has been for so many composers through the centuries and for so many performers and for congregants. And it is one that, there's an outsized number of settings, musical settings of this text when you compare it to other canticles.
Thank you so much, Knox. Yes. We are indeed out of time, but I wanted to thank you. This brought me back to my days as a chorister. I've sung this text time and time and time again because I grew up in this tradition. I will try to fit one question in really briefly at the end. What is a kind of key theological insight you think a composer or set of composers has given to us in their settings of these texts? How, I know you're a person of faith, how has the Magnificat through the lens of a particular composer or composers affected your understanding of who God is or your understanding of Mary in this particular moment?
Thanks, that's a great question. I think the easy part of the text from a compositional standpoint is the celebration and the rejoicing. But what captivates me about it, and I think what captivates so many of these composers, is that section that's about the transformation and this set of parallels, right, of casting down the mighty, lifting up the humble and meek, and those things. And I think that is where I find the most resonance with the text and also with these musical settings, that it really is not just a song of rejoicing, but it's a song about transformation and change and promise and what God is setting out to accomplish and continues to accomplish.
Thank you very much, Knox. Thank you all for being here. You will get a chance, if you stick around for the 11 a.m. service, either in person or online, to hear the Magnificat in several different ways again. It's in the lesson. It's going to be sung by the choir. A paraphrase is going to be sung by all of us. So today is Magnificat Day for sure. We are going to take a break from the forum next week. It'll be the day after Christmas, and I hope you'll take the chance to have a cup of hot chocolate or coffee and some cookies. We will be back in the new year on January 2nd. Our very own Trish Tidwell is a psychotherapist, and she's going to be talking about New Year's resolutions. So we'll see you then. Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy New Year, and we'll see you for the next installment of the forum on January 2nd.